Hello everybody, welcome to the channel. My name is JGod. In today's video, we're going to do the evolution of rifles in the entire Black Ops series, from Black Ops 1 all the way to Black Ops 4. It seems like you guys really enjoyed the shotgun and pistol versions of this video, and you made several requests to make a similar video on the rifle category. So that's what I went ahead and did. I actually covered all the rifles from Black Ops 1 all the way to Black Ops 4, including the DLC weapons. And the final count ended up being 43 rifles in total. So that's what you'll be watching in today's video. You'll be seeing all 43 rifles. So if at any point you do enjoy the video, please remember to hit that like button. I'd be very appreciative. And if you're brand new to the channel, I typically cover Call of Duty news, in-game updates, best class setups, subscriber breakdowns, as well as other tip and trick videos on how to improve a Call of Duty. So if you find yourself enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you can find your way back to the channel. So without further ado, the first rifle we're going to go ahead and take a look at is the M16 assault rifle. And this particular weapon has been seen in several Call of Duties, and I think it's a fan favorite because it's incredibly accurate and it can put down the enemy in as little as a single burst. Personally, I think that burst weapons are very unforgiving. If you can hit center mass on a consistent basis, you're going to feel like they're overpowered, strong. But if you miss even by a hair and you can't be accurate on a consistent basis, you're more than likely not going to be a big fan of these types of weapons. And the next rifle we'll go ahead and take a look at is the Enfield. This particular rifle is a fully automatic weapon, like the majority of rifles in Call of Duty in general. Back during the original Black Ops 1 life cycle, I didn't really use this weapon very often. There was plenty of other weapons that I leaned towards, and this was definitely not one of them. That's not to say it was horrible by any means, but the slower rate of fire led to a slower time to kill, which is never a good thing in Call of Duty. So next one we'll go ahead and take a look at is the M14, which is the first of two semi-automatic weapons that can be found in the original Black Ops. And like the M16, this is one of those weapons that rewards accuracy, especially if you can land 2 successive shots. But obviously if you start missing those shots, you're going to be penalized pretty hard. Now that I covered one of each type of rifle, let me know down in the comment section below which is your favorite. Do you prefer auto, burst, or semi-automatic weapons? Now onto one of my all-time favorite weapons in Call of Duty, the FAMAS. And I think one of the main reasons I like the FAMAS so much is because it had a very fast rate of fire that put the time to kill right up there with the M16 and M14 in Black Ops 1. And on top of that, it had relatively low recoil, so you could actually take out targets at pretty considerable distances. And if you decide to equip extended mags, you could bump your ammo capacity to 45, which could potentially lead to longer feeds. The next weapon we're going to take a look at is the Galil. And one of the funny things about Black Ops 1 is they decided to have a lot of weapons that had very similar properties. And we've already talked about the Enfield, which is very similar to the Galil. So similar in fact that they actually have the exact same rate of fire and time to kill. With that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next weapon, which is the AUG. So like I mentioned a little bit earlier, there were weapons that were very similar. And when it comes to the AUG, it's almost identical to the FAMAS. And the only real difference is a slightly slower reload time, which is almost negligible. So I'm not even sure exactly why I chose the FAMAS over the AUG way back then. Maybe it was just because it's a lower level, or I thought it had less recoil or something like that. But I'd like to know down in the comment section below, which one did you prefer? Did you prefer the AUG or the FAMAS? And with that, we'll be moving on to the next weapon in this category, which is also another semi-automatic weapon known as the FN FAL. And like a lot of the weapons so far that we've talked about, this one has another mirror, and the only real difference is that reload time. The one that this one's very similar to is the other semi-automatic weapon, the M14. So just like with the M14, this one is very unforgiving if you miss those shots, but has an incredibly fast time to kill if you can land both consecutively. So now we'll move on to one of the most popular weapons in pretty much any first-person shooter, and that is the AK-47. When it comes to AK-47, this one is very similar to that Enfield as well as the Galil. But for whatever reason, I always gravitated more towards this particular rifle. Maybe it was the clean iron sights, manageable recoil, or maybe it was just the name, because like I said before, the name is very iconic when it comes to weapons in general. But either way, it was a ton of fun going back into the game and playing with this weapon again. And the next rifle we'll go ahead and talk about is the Commando, which also happens to be one of my top used weapons in Call of Duty Black Ops 1. And when comparing this to the other rifles we've seen so far, this one's very similar to the Enfield, the Galil, and the AK-47. And I think one of the main reasons I like this weapon so much is because it had some clean iron sights, relatively low recoil, and a pretty fast reload time. So which automatic rifle did you lean towards? Was it the Enfield, the Galil, the AK-47, or the Commando? And with that, we'll move on to the last rifle from Black Ops 1, which is the G11. And this is where they actually switched it up a little bit, because this weapon is very similar to the M16, but it has a little bit shorter range and a little bit faster rate of fire. And to be honest, I never really used this weapon during the game's life cycle. And after trying it out for a little bit, I felt that it was just a little bit more forgiving than the M16 was, especially at those medium to short distances. And that's all 10 of the rifles from the original Black Ops. At this point, we'll go ahead and transition into Black Ops 2, aka Hack Ops 2. And if you're not sure what I'm referring to, pretty much every lobby in this game is hacked. So it's because of that some of the Black Ops 2 gameplay will be offline as well as online. And the first rifle we'll go ahead and take a look at from BO2 is the MTAR. And for this weapon, it didn't do anything particularly well, but it also didn't do anything particularly bad. So it's more of one of those average rifles that's just kind of in the game. I don't really remember being a big fan of this weapon, maybe because it was a low level unlock. Obviously, I did use it because I did get diamond on my rifles, but at the end of the day, not very memorable. Interesting to note that Black Ops 2 only had 9 rifles compared to the 10 that Black Ops 1 had. And as you can see, we've moved on to the Type 25. Nothing really special about this one. It did have pretty clean iron sights, but overall it was just pretty average. One of the nice things about going back and playing Black Ops 2 after playing Black Ops 3 and Black Ops 4 is that the recoil in that game is very low for almost all of the assault rifles. And maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe it's just my recoil management has improved over the years, so it just didn't feel like there was a ton of recoil. And with that, we'll go ahead and transition into the only 3-round burst weapon in Black Ops 2, and that's the SWAT 556. And overall, I think this weapon was underrated and underused. But I think a lot of that had to do with another burst firing weapon, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And overall, this weapon wasn't that bad. It was very similar to the M16 and the G11 that we saw back in Black Ops 1. It even had a decent one burst kill potential, but even then it still wasn't good enough to compete with some of the other rifles in Black Ops 2. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next rifle, which is the FAL OSW. And one of the cool things about this weapon is it actually performed well if you decided to attach that fire selector so it could be in semi-auto or automatic, which typically wasn't the case for all the weapons that had that attachment. The other thing that the FAL had going for it is that it was typically 2 to 3 shots to kill, with little to no recoil. So overall, this weapon could be pretty overpowered in the right player's hands. With that, we'll go ahead and transition into the next weapon on the list, which is the M27. And overall, this weapon's very similar to the MTAR with a few slight differences. It did have a slightly weaker damage profile with the exact same rate of fire, but the big advantage I think this one has over the MTAR is even lower recoil. And besides that, just aesthetically, I like the iron sights on the M27 better than the MTAR. I don't know if it's just the open sights just a little bit better for me. But at the end of the day, if I had to pick between the two, even though they're very similar, almost identical, I'd end up going with the M27. And the next rifle we'll go ahead and talk about is the SCAR H, which is probably one of the best rifles in the game, if not one of the best weapons. And even though the SCAR is one of those rifles that has a slightly slower rate of fire, it makes up for it with its incredibly high damage output, which I think is compounded by the headshot multiplier. And I say that because a lot of the newer Call of Duties, the headshot multiplier is 1.1. But during Black Ops 2, most of the rifles had a headshot multiplier of 1.2. So when you combine these two numbers for the SCAR, you end up with a weapon that is almost broken. And an almost identical weapon will appear again in Black Ops 4 with the same exact issue. And that's going to go ahead and transition us into the next weapon, which happens to be another semi-automatic weapon, and that is the SMR. And even though the SMR has a slightly better damage profile than the FAL, one of the reasons why this weapon is nowhere near as popular is because of that recoil. And that's not to say that this weapon has uncontrollable recoil, because it doesn't. And on top of that worse recoil, it actually has a slightly slower rate of fire. So if you're comparing the two, more than likely players are going to choose to go with the FAL over the SMR. And that's going to go ahead and bring us to our next rifle, which is the M8A1. And this weapon shares a very uncommon weapon category with only a handful of other rifles, and that is the 4-round burst rifle. Even though this weapon is very similar to some of the other rifles we've seen so far in that burst rifle category, one of the things that makes it better than those other ones is that it's just a little bit more forgiving because it has a faster rate of fire. And when it comes to burst fired or semi-automatic weapons, the rate of fire matters. One of the most important parts for burst firing weapons is the delay between shots. And because the delay is very small on the M8A1, that's where this weapon excels. And with that, we'll go ahead and transition into what I believe is one of the best rifles in Black Ops 2, which is the AN-94. And overall, this is probably my favorite rifle from Black Ops 2 because it was an all-around beast. A very competitive damage profile with almost no recoil. And for whatever reason, I really like the iron sights, even though they're not clutter free. But besides all that, this weapon actually had a built-in perk. And the perk actually made it so that the first 2 shots fired out of this weapon fired faster than your normal rate of fire. So if your first shot accuracy was on point, you dominate with this weapon. And that's going to be it for Black Ops 2. At this point, we'll go ahead and transition to Black Ops 3. And just a quick reminder to hit that like button and subscribe with notifications on if you're enjoying the video so far. So the first rifle we'll go ahead and talk about is the KN-44, which happens to be one of the more popular weapons in Black Ops 3. Overall, I thought this weapon was pretty good. Decent damage with very low recoil. And what was funny about this clip is I ran out of ammo with the KN and ended up picking up the next weapon on our list, which is the XR2. And the XR2 is a 3-round burst fire weapon, and it's not all that different compared to the burst fire weapons we've seen so far. So overall, nothing very memorable for this specific weapon. And with that, we'll go ahead and transition to the HVK-30. And when it comes to the HVK, it's basically one of those average to slightly above average rifles. And that's not a bad thing. That just means it's not bad at anything, and it's not necessarily good at anything either. And in my opinion, it's very similar to that XR2 because it's not very memorable. But with that, we'll go ahead and transition to the next weapon, which is the ICR-1. And what's funny about the ICR is it's basically a weaker version than the HVK that we just talked about. Even though it has a similar rate of fire and similar recoil of the HVK, the big drawback is its damage. Another thing that's funny about this weapon is we'll see it appear again in Black Ops 4 as the ICR-7. Which doesn't make much sense in my opinion because based off the timeline, BO3 comes after BO4. So technically the ICR-7 should have been in BO3 and the ICR-1 should have been in BO4. And that's going to go ahead and transition us to the Man of War, which is probably my most favorite weapon in Black Ops 3. And when comparing this weapon to Black Ops 2, the closest resemblance is the Scar H. A little bit lower rate of fire, but makes up for it with its damage output. And I think this weapon shines so much in Black Ops 3 because of the advanced movement. And I guess the same could be said for a lot of the other weapons in the game. If you were able to master that advanced movement, you made a lot more weapons viable. I already said that this is pretty much my favorite rifle in Black Ops 3, but let me know down in the comment section below where does it rank for you. And that's going to go ahead and transition us to the Shiva, which is another semi-automatic weapon. Overall, I think I preferred the M14 and the FAL OSW. Even though I know the Shiva is very strong, I just didn't really like it in Black Ops 3. Maybe I didn't give it enough time, but overall it can be very strong, especially since it has that 2-shot kill potential. And it's with that we'll go ahead and transition into the M8A7, which is very similar to that M8A1 from Black Ops 2. And overall, I felt like it was very powerful in Black Ops 3. And I felt overall it was pretty consistent because you're able to get a lot of one-burst kills. It also felt like the fire rate was pretty forgiving if you missed a few shots, which I talked about earlier as being one of the biggest variables when it comes to burst fire weapons. And with that, we'll go ahead and transition into our first DLC weapon, which is the MX Garand. And overall, this weapon's pretty decent, but it has one major flaw. And that major flaw is that you cannot reload whenever you want. You have to actually wait till you run out of ammo, and then you'll automatically be prompted to reload. Which means that sometimes you're going to put yourself in a pretty bad position or just have to waste ammo along the way. So even though it's a pretty decent semi-automatic weapon, this reload mechanic is a huge problem in my opinion. And with that, we'll go ahead and transition into the next rifle, which is the FFAR. And one of the interesting things about this weapon is in the game files, it's actually labeled as the FAMAS. So it's no wonder I'm a big fan of this weapon. I think the time to kill, rate of fire all felt really good. And it felt actually familiar when I used it. And even if you look at the in-game weapon model, it looks very similar to the FAMAS. And that's going to bring us to the next DLC weapon, which is the Peacekeeper MK2. And again, this one's a little bit more middle-of-the-road weapon. It's going to be right there with the HVK ICR. And at the end of the day, not very memorable. Obviously, some of you might have had a different experience with the Peacekeeper, but overall, I wasn't a huge fan. The next weapon on the list is going to be the LV8 Basilisk. And this rifle is definitely a little bit of an odd one. And the main reason for that is because it actually has two different things going on. When you pull the trigger on this rifle, there's a slight delay between actually pulling the trigger and bullets coming out. So if you can't react quick enough, a lot of times you're going to be in a pretty bad spot. And the other part of this weapon that actually makes it a little bit overpowered is the rate of fire. So it has the second highest rate of fire in Black Ops 3, only behind the Vesper. And that's with a relatively low recoil. So overall, I don't really know how to rate this weapon because in some scenarios it could be good and other ones it could be garbage. So kind of hard to tell. With that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next one, which is one we've already seen before, and that is the M16. And when you use that base version of the M16, it's going to look and feel a lot like it did in Black Ops 1. But the biggest difference in Black Ops 3 is you're able to actually load it up with a ton of attachments. But even when it's all said and done, it's really not that much different than any of the 3-round burst rifles that we've seen so far. So pretty cool if you want to go for that nostalgia feel, but definitely not overpowered. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the Galil, which is another Black Ops 1 weapon. And I think this one kind of gets thrown in with the Peacekeeper, the HVK, the ICR as a middle-of-the-road weapon. Nothing really special, but just like the M16, if you're looking for a little bit of nostalgia with a ton of attachments, this is a good way to go. The next weapon up is the KVK-99M. And even though that name doesn't really stand out, you might recognize the weapon. This is a throwback to the AN-94 from Black Ops 2. And the cool thing is they actually carried over that special perk that the AN-94 had, which basically made it so the first shots came out faster than the rest of the other bullets. So it was definitely fun trying this one out in Black Ops 3 after already experiencing it in Black Ops 2. And the great part is they pretty much kept it identical to the way it was in Black Ops 2. I'm definitely a huge fan of how it turned out in this game. And the last DLC weapon from BO3 is the M14. That's right, another throwback weapon to BO1. And just like I explained with the M16 and the Galil, this weapon feels very similar and almost identical to the BO1 version. So if you want to hit that nostalgia feel, you can definitely try out this weapon or go ahead and max it out with all the attachments possible. And that pretty much wraps it up for Black Ops 3. The first weapon we'll be covering in Black Ops 4 is the ICR-7. So when it comes to the ICR-7, it's nothing special. It's just a very reliable weapon, low recoil, average damage, average reload, average movement, really nothing special. Right when the game launched, this weapon was a little too strong and has since been nerfed. And in my opinion, I think it's balanced perfectly at the moment. Not too strong, not too weak, just average. And with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next weapon, which is the KN-57. And what's funny about the KN, even though it doesn't really look like it, actually reminds me a lot of that AN-94 and that KVK-99M. So I definitely have a lot of fun using the KN-57. So go ahead and let me know down in the comment section below, does the KN remind you of either of those two weapons I just listed? And one of the nice things about Black Ops 4, depending on who you ask, is that the rifles are fairly balanced with one exception. And that leads us into the next weapon, which is the Rampart 17. And when it comes to the Rampart 17, it actually reminds me of a few different weapons, and that is the Scar H and the Man of War. Both known for having a little bit lower than average rate of fire with an above average damage output. And the part that makes the Rampart so broken in Black Ops 4 is the fact that you can actually run high caliber 1 as well as high caliber 2. So it increases the area of extra damage from just the head to the chest and above. So you can actually have that same or even higher damage output of the Scar and the Man of War without actually having to be so precise. And it's for that reason that I think this weapon will get a nerf in some way. And with that, we'll go ahead and transition to the next weapon, which is the Vapor XKG. Like I mentioned earlier, the rifles are fairly balanced with each other in Black Ops 4. So this one is very similar to the KN, and the biggest difference comes down to the attachments. So at the end of the day, it's really going to come down to your playstyle, because in Black Ops 4 they choose which attachments are available on each weapon versus every weapon having the same options. So I'm not even sure why I like the Vapor so much, or even why I prefer it over the KN. Maybe it's because I got to use it in the alpha build at CWL Anaheim. Either way, it's a fairly balanced rifle and definitely not overpowered. And with that, we'll go ahead and transition to the number one competitive weapon, which is the Maddox RFT. And I think what makes this rifle so good is because it has a fast rate of fire with very minimal recoil. And since it can't have the same attachments as that ICR, it can't run that double grip, it'll never be quite as accurate. So in my opinion, this is one of those weapons that really shines in a good player's hands. And I think one of the best parts about this weapon is it can actually be used like an SMG in those close engagements. But I think a lot of that has to do with its higher than average fire rate. So definitely a top tier rifle, but not overpowered by any means. The next rifle we'll go ahead and talk about is the Auger DMR. And one thing they decided to do differently in Black Ops 4 is to separate the rifles into two categories: the assault rifles as well as the tactical rifles, which basically makes it so that the auto rifles are labeled as assault rifles, and makes it so all the semi-automatic as well as all the burst firing weapons are in one category labeled as tactical rifles. So the Auger DMR is very similar to what we've seen in the previous Call of Duty so far: the M14, the FAL-OSW, and the Shiva. And one of the craziest things about this weapon is it's very similar to the Rampart in the fact that it can run high caliber 1 as well as high caliber 2, which actually wouldn't sound like that big of a deal when you compare it to those other 2-shot kill weapons. But in a game where they've actually gone ahead and increased the time to kill by increasing the health, it makes those weapons that much stronger. So this is one of those weapons that fits into those categories as feeling both very weak and overpowered. So with that, we'll go ahead and switch over to the ABR-223. And this one definitely has to be one of the worst weapons with a 3-round burst in Black Ops history. And the main reason I say that is because out of all the 3-round burst weapons that we've seen in today's video, it is the only one that does not have a single burst kill potential, which is great for balance, but horrible when you're using this weapon. One way they've tried to offset this horrendous time to kill is by adding operator mods. And this particular weapon's operator mod is called the repeater, which basically makes it fire faster the longer you hold the trigger, which in my opinion helps, but not by much. And with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next rifle, which is this swordfish. So the swordfish is actually one of those rare weapons that fires a 4-round burst. But unlike those other 4-round burst weapons we've seen so far, this is the only one that cannot kill someone with a single burst. At least not without an operator mod. And the swordfish's operator mod is called the pentaburst, which basically converts it from a 4-round burst to a 5-round burst weapon. So if you're a huge fan of those 1-burst kills, this is definitely the way you need to go if you're going to be playing Black Ops 4. So it's funny how this game has made operator mods to make these weapons close as possible to their former selves. And with that, we'll go ahead and transition into the first DLC rifle of Black Ops 4, which is the SWAT RFT. So when it comes to the SWAT, it's really nothing special. It's just one of those average guns, slightly above average depending on what attachments you put on it. But overall, it's going to be very similar to the ICR with slightly more recoil. So now that we've seen how many DLC weapons that came in Black Ops 3, I really wonder how many are going to be added to Black Ops 4 that are basically what we've seen in the past. Since that scenario is more than likely, let me know down in the comments section below what weapon you'd like to see from Black Ops 1, 2, or 3 reappear in Black Ops 4 as a DLC rifle. And that covers all 43 weapons in the Black Ops series. Just a quick reminder to make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you want to find your way back to the channel. I really appreciate all the support you showed on the previous videos I did about the evolution of pistols and shotguns. If you guys have an idea for a future video, go ahead and let me know down in the comment section below. Appreciate all the support. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.